fill that information out for me, okay?
Thank you.
She was a single empty nester, making a new beginning.
It's like your life restarts.
She's making moves. Things are happening for her.
A new city, a new job, and a new man.
Things are going very well. He's just what she needs.
She's successful, she's in love, everything falls in place.
But then she disappears without a trace.
You coming home tonight or what? Call when you get his message.
Have you heard anything from her?
Yes, sir.
Her SUV had been parked in the same spot, and that's what prompted him to call the police.
But he isn't the only one worried.
Her daughter hadn't heard from her in like 5 days.
She was afraid something like this might happen.
And the search for answers will reveal why.
He served more than 20 years in prison.
He had all these years to think about the mistakes that he had made.
You just simply can't get away with murder anymore.
November 10th, 2020. It's a busy Tuesday in Atlanta, Georgia, where life is just starting to return to normal after COVID-19 turned everything upside down.
The shutdown really impacted people in their feeling isolated and their connection to people. And then I noticed that folks were outside, at restaurants like life was normal again.
People were still cautious, but people were happy to get back out. And I think it was a big sigh of relief to be back into the world. People started to feel like themselves again.
But that afternoon, things still feel far from normal for Tracy Brock.
Tracy's kind of worried about her mom.
Tracy, who lives in Indiana, speaks to her mom, Shawn Macklin, in Atlanta almost every day.
I've been trying to reach you all weekend.
She considered her mom kind of like her best friend.
And now here we are in the pandemic, in the midst of it. She doesn't know what's happening. She can't get in touch with her mom.
Call me. Love you.
It's now been 5 days since they last spoke.
Tracy is concerned, so she calls and asks the police to go by there to do a welfare check.
Atlanta non-emergency, how can I help you?
Hello, I'm calling to request a welfare check on my mom. She has a broken foot.
Her mother had just hurt her foot, so she had a boot on her leg.
Tracy was concerned, had her mother fallen and couldn't get up?
I'm just worried.
"56-year-old Shawn Macklin had spent most of her life serving others.
Shawn was a compassionate person. She worked in healthcare. She dedicated her life in a field where she could help others.
Folks who work in healthcare love people. They love working with people.
But Shawn's greatest love was her daughter.
She was there for her family, and she was an amazing mother.
Mother and daughter were especially close.
She's like her best friend.
And once Tracy had moved out and started having kids of her own, Shawn was ready to make a big life change.
At 56, you can find yourself in limbo because no, you're not 20, but you're also not 80. You have a lot of life ahead of you. So now what do I do? Where's my place in the world?
The search took her to Atlanta.
She really wanted to kind of live and enjoy, independence. So she moved down to Atlanta.
She got a job as an office manager with a local healthcare company.
Hi, you have an appointment this morning?
I have an appointment.
But even with a new city and a new job, there's still something missing.
She's looking for a partnership, someone who can help make her feel more stable.
Okay, thank you so much.
Has anyone told you how infectious your smile is?
You can't say infectious in a doctor's office.
And in 2019, she met Bernard Stokes.
He's in his mid-50s, charismatic and charming.
Immediately, they hit it off. There's an instant attraction.
She's excited. Like, ooh, the potential is attractive.
You know, my schedule's pretty flexible. Think you might want to meet me for some coffee?
I'd like that. Thank you.
You're very welcome.
That was probably exhilarating for her, you know, and you fall really quick when that happens.
They get together and they start seeing each other. This is what Sean has been waiting for.
And she wasn't about to wait any longer.
The two of them decided to take their relationship to the next level, and they moved in together. Bernard was a maintenance man for an apartment complex, and because of his job, he got an apartment.
He had his own place. She has a good job. He has a good job. So things are going very well for Sean at this point.
She's successful, she's in love, she felt absolutely wonderful.
Okay.
But now Sean's daughter has called the Atlanta police, worried about her mother.
When she called, she said that they usually talk every single day and she hadn't heard from her in like 5 days.
I'm afraid she might have fallen.
Her mother had recently fractured her foot and was wearing a boot on her leg.
With this boot on her foot, it's probably more challenging to move.
Her daughter said she would have checked on Sean in person, but she lives out of state.
And with the pandemic still a threat, her travel options are limited.
In November of 2020, even though the pandemic was kind of settling down, we were still in limbo in Atlanta. People were still dying because of COVID. It was still a very, very serious disease.
Not being able to see loved ones, not being able to see friends. That whole social dynamic really caused people some stress and anxiety.
No problem. We'll get someone right over there.
Thank you.
A welfare check is basically 911 dispatcher will dispatch an officer out to a location, and the officer will basically knock to see if someone comes to the door. They may walk around, look in the windows, looking for any reason for concern.
When the officer gets to Sean's apartment, someone answers his knock.
A man in his 50s opens the door.
It's Sean's boyfriend, Bernard.
You hear about Sean?
He expresses that he's worried about her.
He hasn't seen her since she left for work 4 days ago.
I hadn't seen her in a few days, but I already filed a missing person report.
We'll get you checked in, okay?
In Atlanta, Georgia, 56-year-old Sean Macklin was making the most of her newfound freedom.
When you become an empty nester, it's like your life restarts.
She was looking for a life where she can enjoy herself.
And she'd found the perfect man to grow older with.
He's charismatic, just what she needs now, someone to love on her.
She's successful, she's in love. They were looking forward to building their future.
I hadn't seen her in about 4 or 5 days.
But now Atlanta police are at the couple's apartment after Sean's daughter asked for a welfare check.
She hasn't heard from her mom. She speaks to her mom every single day.
And when Sean's boyfriend Bernard comes to the door, he says he tried to report her missing.
When was that?
A couple of days ago.
And that was the last time you saw her?
It was a couple of days before that.
He said that they had some personal issues going on.
Issues? What type of issues?
Hell, I just asked her to move out.
He said that he and Sean were in the process of splitting up.
He was given the apartment through his work, and so it was her who had to leave. And she agreed.
We still care about each other, but you know it's for the best.
I found an apartment.
He said that she actually was already packing her stuff and preparing to move.
According to Bernard, that's one reason it took him a couple days to call the police and report her missing.
He says on Friday the 6th, Sean got up at her usual time to get ready for work.
I'll be out of here soon.
All right. I can help you move your stuff if you need me to.
Thanks. I'm off to work.
And then she left for work after that.
And that was the last time you saw her?
Yeah.
Bernard says he went back to bed and he didn't get up until it was time for him to go to work.
But he says that when he got home, Sean wasn't there.
Sean didn't come home that night, and Bernard thought maybe she spent the night at a friend's house.
But then the weekend came and went with no sign of her.
It wasn't until Sunday when he started getting worried.
He noticed that her SUV had been parked in the same spot as it was on Thursday night. That's what prompted him to call the police because he thought something was wrong.
I called the cops. They came out, but they didn't believe me.
I called 911 to say, hey, I'm concerned about her.
After the officers looked around, they said that they didn't see anything wrong.
Did I get a good number?
Especially after he explained that Sean was in the process of moving out.
But the officer conducting the welfare check isn't as willing to let things go.
After all, Bernard wasn't the only one who hadn't heard from her.
Had you tried contacting her daughter?
Well, she hasn't made contact with Tracy. That's why I'm here.
She haven't contacted Tracy? Something must be wrong.
Let me make contact with the detectives and I'll be in touch.
After talking to Bernard, the officer passes the information off to detectives.
First, he confirmed that he had called the police and attempted to report her missing.
In fact, they even find body cam footage from the encounter.
Have you heard anything from her?
Yes, sir. That's why I called.
In the video, he explains the impeding breakup and how she's moving out.
Yeah, so man, I look around.
No, go ahead. Look.
Stuff haven't moved since then?
No, sir. And that was my concern.
With little else to go on, the officer's hands are tied.
I looked at the arrest record. She's not showing up on that either, as well as any hospital.
But based on what they've learned from Sean's daughter and Bernard, investigators certainly feel the situation merits a missing persons report.
Yeah, that seems kind of strange.
We'll take it from here. Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
The detectives started by issuing a subpoena for Sean's cell phone records.
They know the phone records will show where she's been, if she's used her phone at all. It will ping her location.
Then the detectives follow up at the doctor's office where Sean works.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi, hello, who are y'all? Her boss explains that everyone loves her. She's a joy to work with.
She says that Sean is incredibly reliable and a hard worker.
She also says that Sean rarely ever calls in sick.
She always went to work on time.
So it was very surprising and shocking when she didn't show up and didn't call.
I tried to reach out to her Friday.
Sean's manager said that they sent text messages during the morning hours and then stated they tried to call during the afternoon. But phone went straight to voicemail.
She never called you back?
No, which was really unlike her.
So now detectives are curious. Did Sean talk much about her personal life at work?
Her manager says that she was pretty private.
That is, until recently.
She started opening up about issues she was having with Bernard.
They were going through a breakup.
And according to her manager, Sean and Bernard were not on good terms.
This contradicted what Bernard had told detectives.
The manager also said that one big issue stood out.
He was evicting her.
Detectives investigating the disappearance of Sean Macklin have learned that her boyfriend, Bernard Stokes, was trying to evict the 56-year-old office manager from their apartment.
The breakup was not as amicable as Bernard had painted the picture.
She was having with Bernard.
Her manager actually stated Sean requested Monday off so that she can go to court to deal with the eviction.
Which is one reason Sean's manager wasn't too worried when she didn't show up at work on Friday.
I just thought she took off because, she was trying to find a place or something.
But then she says she received a strange call at the office on Monday.
Bernard called and asked for Sean.
She thought it was strange that he would call her job looking for when he knew that she was supposed to be in court with him.
I had no idea she was missing.
Well, thank you, ma'am, for your time.
All right, thank you so much.
All right, thank you.
By the time detectives return to the station from Sean's workplace, the phone records they've requested are waiting for them.
They noticed she hasn't made any outgoing calls since Thursday, the 5th.
But there's several incoming calls, including calls from Bernard and Tracy.
That alone will cause detectives some concern.
However, the incoming call data does allow detectives to track Sean's movements.
The phone companies can tell detectives what location or what tower that person was near.
The phone pinged off of 2 towers.
The first ping was an hour southwest of Atlanta, in the small town of Grantville.
After it pinged in Grantville, it pinged again in Fairburn, Georgia. Now, Fairburn is halfway between Atlanta and Grantville.
So it seems like Sean goes to Grantville and starts making her way back to Atlanta.
And this was 7 hours after Bernard said that he last saw Sean.
And after that, the phone went dead.
It would be alarming if you're saying that the person is missing and then you see activity cease.
But do the phone records mean something happened to Sean? Or that she'd even gone to Grantville?
Someone else could have been in possession of the phone.
Hoping for more information, the detectives contact Sean's daughter, Tracy.
Hello?
They asked if her mother knew anybody in Granville.
I don't think so. She rarely knows anyone outside of work as far as I know. Why?
Well, her phone pinged there recently.
What?
She was already worried about her mom, and now it's even more.
She also told detectives that she's been doing a little digging on her own.
She was able to log into her mom's emails.
And what she found was troubling.
There was no activity since the 5th. There were several important emails that she didn't answer, and one was an approval for a new apartment.
The message was never opened.
Based on the phone activity and the unopened emails, the detectives believe Sean went off the grid sometime Friday.
Detectives asked Tracy, was there anyone who would want to harm your mom?
And that's when she said she was afraid something like this might happen.
What do you mean?
Well, I didn't want to say anything to begin with because I was hoping it was nothing.
But now, Sean's daughter reveals the awful truth.
Bernard was actually abusive towards her mother.
Are you sure?
Well, that's what she said.
Tracy says it started when her mother became suspicious of Bernard.
Where he's working as a maintenance man. He'll be in their houses for hours, so Miss Macklin would sometimes find it interesting that these women would want to cook for him. Wanted him to come by just to check.
Sean went through Bernard's phone looking for other women's messages and texts.
And it turned out that her suspicions may have been justified.
He was talking to another woman.
The hell are you doing?
And when Sean confronted Bernard about it, he turned violent.
Give him my phone. Give him my phone.
Tracy says that he actually broke Sean's arm.
Give me my phone!
And allegedly, the boot that she had on her foot was also because of him.
Did you ever witness him being violent?
No.
Have you ever heard him threaten her?
Not exactly.
But Tracy does say that her mother was growing increasingly afraid of Bernard.
She even took out a life insurance policy.
Tracy also said that her mother obtained a carry permit and got a gun.
According to her daughter, that's why she'd started looking for a new place.
But she didn't want to leave before having somewhere else to go.
I told her just to get out, go to a shelter if she have to. But she said she would be okay.
So at this point, Tracy is afraid that Bernard really harmed her mom.
The detectives are starting to think so too.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
We'll be in touch.
When they look into his background, they realize that there had been domestic calls made several times to the apartment.
Now, when police were called to come to Sean's and Bernard's house, they were all verbal arguments.
There isn't any evidence of physical abuse, including the injuries that Tracy claims her mom sustained.
But does that mean that what Sean told her daughter isn't true?
Domestic violence happens behind closed doors and not always is reported.
And in instances where the police will come, nothing will happen because the abuser is so good at hiding and disguising what is actually going on.
However, there are some things that Bernard can't hide from the detectives.
He has a litany of charges.
But what is most shocking is that in 1992, he was convicted of murder.
Detectives investigating the disappearance of Sean Macklin have just learned that her boyfriend Bernard has been previously convicted of murder.
In the 1992 murder, he killed his roommate.
At first, he says he murdered his roommate out of self-defense, thinking that the roommate was an intruder.
He told an entire story. How he heard noise, he grabbed a gun, and shot this person by mistake.
It might have worked, if not for one thing.
I'm leaving. Y'all need my money. I don't have your money. I'm leaving. You're not leaving, going anywhere. How you gonna try to make you?
His roommate had a feeling that he was going to do something to him. So what his roommate did was put a recorder in his pocket.
And the recorder told a very different story than the one Bernard gave police.
They actually had an argument. They were arguing about him moving.
This was a dispute over rent.
During this argument, he's asking Stokes questions. Why do you have that gun in your hand? What are you going to do with that gun? And you can hear the gun go off.
The recording even captured Bernard attempting to cover up the crime.
Stokes calls 911, tell 911 that he believes that someone was trying to break into the home, and he mistakenly shot this roommate.
The tape was more than enough to put Bernard away.
He took that case to trial, he lost, and he was convicted.
He served more than 20 years in prison before being released on parole.
And now that Sean is missing, the detectives wonder if Bernard is making a second attempt at getting away with murder.
When he was caught the first time, he had all these years to kind of think about the mistakes that he had made.
After uncovering Bernard's prior conviction, the detectives reach out to his parole officer.
His PO says that since he's been released, he has been mild-mannered and he's trying to get his life together.
The parole officer also says that Sean knew about his past.
Sean was aware of this murder, and she was trying to help him. She had a loving heart. You know, she wanted to see him succeed.
That says a lot about her personality, right? She may have just believed in him, or maybe she wanted really to believe in love that bad to where she would kind of look past even murder.
But had her faith in Bernard ended up costing Sean her life?
Just because Bernard's parole officer speaks highly of him does not mean that he would not kill again.
Hoping to find out, the detectives head to Bernard's apartment with a search warrant.
How's it going? We got a warrant to search your apartment.
When detectives confront Bernard, he doesn't shy away from his criminal background, nor does he shy away from the domestic calls.
But he does say that Sean was the instigator.
She's jealous, she's controlling. She even tried to call my kid's mom and threaten her. It was crazy.
He definitely tried to make himself into the victim.
According to Bernard, that's why they were splitting up.
He said he just got tired of Sean's jealousy.
He just wanted her to leave.
And when she tried to stall it, she said she had to wait till she get her place.
That's why he had no choice but to file the eviction.
The detectives have their doubts, though.
Eviction wasn't the only way to get rid of Sean.
So she just left? Yeah. And I'm not lying about it. Look here.
He tells detectives he has a video, and you can see how Sean was.
He actually recorded the last argument they had.
The video is only a few seconds long, but you can hear Sean yelling at Bernard from the bathroom.
I don't give a damn.
Shit, that's what I'm saying. You do them but take it out on me.
I ain't taking nothing out on you. I don't want to take your life out on you. It's your life.
You do.
And Bernard explains that this is a clear indication that she was alive and well the morning of her disappearance.
He says this happened moments before she left for work.
But is it the proof Bernard claims it is?
And do you know where she went after she left? No.
He told him it was none of his business since they were broken up.
And he also says that he went back to sleep after she left for work on Friday morning. And he didn't leave the apartment until it was time for him to go to work, which was around 8 a.m.
That's what Bernard claims, but the detectives aren't willing to take his word for it.
Well, we're going to take a look around. Hang tight.
And since they have a search warrant, there's nothing he can do to stop them from looking around.
They also luminol the apartment.
Luminol is a chemical that can reveal where someone has cleaned up bloodstains.
At first, the results are disappointing.
That's until they get to the bathroom.
And when we luminol the bathroom, you could see blood.
Detectives investigating Sean Macklin's disappearance have just found evidence of blood in the apartment she shared with her boyfriend, Bernard Stokes.
Luminol reveals that there is splatters of blood in the bathroom.
You can see blood smears on the bathroom handle, the bathroom sink, and also on the floor.
There's also blood on the molding and a comb on the counter.
It's not enough to prove that anyone was killed in the bathroom, but it is quite suspicious.
Hey, Bernard.
When detectives ask Bernard about the blood, he says he has no idea how it got there.
However, given all they knew about Bernard's criminal past and his alleged abuse of Sean, the detectives didn't believe him.
All right, we're going to have you come down to the precinct for some more questions. We'll meet you down there. It's fine.
But before they head back to the station, the detectives stop by the apartment complex's management office.
They want to see the surveillance video, the hours surrounding Sean's disappearance.
When they review the video, they get the first evidence that Bernard is lying.
First of all, they're able to see Sean the evening before her disappearance.
On November 5th, around 7 p.m., you see on surveillance video, she exits her car and she goes into her building.
But they never see her leave again.
And there's no chance she could have left out a different exit?
No, we have 17 cameras. It'd have showed up if so.
You roll forward to the next morning?
Sure.
However, the cameras do capture Bernard leaving early the next morning.
They see Bernard leave the apartment on the 6th at 6:52 a.m.
Earlier, in his statement to police, he said he didn't leave till 8 that morning.
And the lie isn't the only thing the cameras catch.
We see him kind of back his pickup truck to the trash compactor area, and the bed was empty.
Unfortunately, the cameras don't pick up what happened.
But when he pulls back out 20 minutes later, there's several items in the bed.
One of the items that they see is a big box.
Where did this box come from? And why does he have it?
For detectives, the answer is simple.
Her body was in that box.
In his hallway, there's no cameras that lead to the compactor where we believe he drug her body before he backed his truck in and picked the body up and put it in the truck.
Bernard then leaves the complex and doesn't return until 4:30 that afternoon.
And guess what's missing from the truck? That big box.
And when he gets out of the truck, Bernard is also wearing different clothes than he had on when he left.
So where did he go for 7 hours? What happened to the stuff in the bed of his truck? And why is he wearing different clothing?
Detectives believe there may be a way to answer at least some of those questions.
Detectives place a trace on his license plate for the truck.
The trace allows detectives to go through the reams of data collected by traffic cameras and license plate readers scattered throughout Metro Atlanta.
You just simply can't get away with murder anymore. We have too much technology.
After requesting the data, the detectives sit down with Bernard.
They want to see if Bernard's going to be honest.
Detectives ask him, what did he do in the moments after Sean left?
Unaware of what detectives have uncovered, Bernard sticks to his story.
I told you after she left, I went back to sleep and I didn't get up to about 8 a.m.
So detectives press him and ask him, did he go outside? And he says no.
You never left the apartment at all?
No, I was in bed.
Detectives then let him know, we saw you on camera, and then he explains, finally, oh yeah, I went out to go get a cigar.
Detectives don't believe him at all.
So detectives try to appeal to Bernard's compassion.
You must have loved Sean. Don't you want to help us find her?
Of course.
He acknowledges he cared about her and he wouldn't do anything to hurt her.
But then he reveals something that is very interesting to police.
He tells detectives that he believes Sean and her daughter organized her disappearance.
Why would they do that?
To get back at me, I guess.
He said Sean was mad that he was kicking her out.
And you didn't have anything to do with it.
That's what I've been trying to tell you.
But the detectives are about to call his bluff.
So, you don't have a problem taking a polygraph test?
And that's when he shuts down.
He does not want to talk anymore.
It's like I'm gonna need a lawyer.
Suspected of killing his missing girlfriend, Sean Macklin, 57-year-old Bernard Stokes is now refusing to say more to detectives without an attorney.
He stopped talking as soon as the detective suggested that he take a polygraph.
It's enough to convince the detectives that he's lying.
We know that they were going through problems. She was leaving him. And so, as we know, an indicator of homicide is when the victim of the domestic violence finally decides to leave.
However, something is still missing.
You have a murder case without a body.
Which is why the detectives had high hopes for the license plate recognition data.
And when they receive the results of the trace, they get a clear picture of where Bernard went the morning Sean disappeared.
Bernard left Atlanta and headed to Grantville.
Exactly where Sean's phone pinged.
2 hours later, he was recorded in College Park, a few miles from where Sean's phone last pinged.
Then they pick up his truck in Riverdale at a store.
Through surveillance, we watch him buy new men's clothes, going into the men's bathroom, changing those clothes from the clothes that he had on from when he left the apartment, and then throwing those clothes into the dumpster.
But unfortunately, even with a detailed plot of Bernard's movements that day, detectives still come up short.
They never found her body.
Other than the hits of following him through the course of him driving throughout Georgia, we don't know what he did. That is something that's still a mystery to us.
Bernard, stand up.
Despite that, the detectives place Bernard under arrest for murder.
phone data, the license plate, the blood in the bathroom, and the surveillance video was enough evidence to make a good case.
But without Sean's body, will it be enough for a conviction when Bernard goes on trial in October of 2023?
These cases are often very hard to prosecute.
That's a very difficult climb because you have jurors wondering, do you really know if this person is dead or not?
I'll be out of here soon.
When they lay out their case, the prosecutors contend that Bernard and Sean got into an argument because she was leaving him.
She got approved for her apartment the day that we believe this disagreement happened. Mr. Stokes knew that.
So you think you're just gonna move out?
I thought that's what you wanted.
It's possible that his goal in evicting Sean was another attempt at maintaining control. And when she did not beg for him back, when he lost that control, he couldn't take it.
The prosecutors admit that they don't know exactly how he killed Sean.
But they argue that her body was in the box Bernard hauled away from his apartment the morning she disappeared.
The prosecution also argues that Bernard only reported Sean missing to cover his tracks.
In addition, and this is how sneaky he was, he actually called Miss Macklin's phone and left voicemails on her phone to cover it up.
You coming home tonight or what? It's late.
When it's the defense's turn, Bernard says that he'd been just as desperate to find Sean as anyone.
Bernard maintained his innocence throughout the trial.
But Bernard's claims make little impression on the jury.
Even without a body, the jury believes that the evidence is sufficient to convict Bernard.
He didn't think that people would take all the steps necessary that would be required to prove him guilty of murder. And, we did.
He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
It's a welcome relief to those wanting to see Bernard off the streets.
When the judge sentenced him to life without the possibility of parole, it was even better. Because we know that he doesn't even have a chance, like he did for the 1992 murder, to get out and hurt anyone else.
But the prosecutors also see Sean's story as a warning to others.
Something that stuck with me in this case was that she stayed because she wanted to wait until she was secure enough to leave. I wish she had left.
It also continues to haunt the family and friends that Sean left behind.
It's challenging because they never found the body. When we're thinking about grief, when we're thinking about closure, without having a body, having a memorial, it doesn't allow you to process your emotional experiences.
And for her daughter, Sean's loss means that her children will grow up without their grandmother.
Grief is tricky. It'll sneak up on you when you least expect it. So when grief comes out of nowhere, you flow with it. You process it. Find the different tools to help you connect to the loved one, to the memories. Process your emotional experiences. That way you don't get stuck in the quicksand.
Sean was a good woman who raised her daughter, who built a career and worked hard for herself. She thought she was lucky to find love again in her 50s, but instead, it ended her life.
There are cases that remain unsolved because investigators never find the person responsible. There are cases that remain unsolved because the evidence disappears with time. And then there are cases in which the truth seems to be present all along, but remains buried beneath years of uncertainty, conflicting statements, incomplete evidence, and questions that no one can answer with certainty. The story of Haddon Irving Clark belongs to that third category. In Maryland, two people disappeared 6 years apart. One was a 6-year-old girl named Michelle Dorr. The other was a 23-year-old woman named Laura Hodling. Their lives were completely different. Their circumstances were different. Their families were different. Yet eventually, both cases would lead investigators to the same man. Hadden Clark would ultimately be convicted in connection with both deaths. But the path to those convictions was neither simple nor direct. In Michelle's case, nearly 14 years would pass between the day she disappeared and the eventual recovery of her remains. In Laura's case, the investigation would move much faster. But it would also expose a connection to an older mystery that investigators had never completely forgotten. And between those two cases lies one of the most important distinctions in any responsible true crime story: the difference between what is proven and what is suspected. Hadden Clark has often been associated with other disappearances and has acquired the sensational nickname the Sunset Murderer in some popular accounts. But the confirmed record is narrower. The two homicide cases established against him were those of Michelle Dorr, 6 years old, and Laura Hodling, 23 years old. Other possible connections have been discussed over the years, but they should not be transformed into confirmed victims without evidence or a court finding. That distinction matters because the real story is already disturbing enough without exaggeration. It begins on May 31st, 1986, in Silver Spring, Maryland. Michelle Dorr was 6 years old. She was at her father's home on Sudbury Road, in a neighborhood where people were familiar with one another and where a child could know the adults living nearby. Michelle was not simply surrounded by strangers. She had connections within the neighborhood, including a friendship with Elizabeth, the daughter of Hadden Clark's brother, Jeffrey. Clark himself lived very close to the Dorr family. That proximity would become important later, but in 1986, there was no sufficient evidence to establish that he had anything to do with Michelle's disappearance. According to the Maryland court record, Michelle was last seen in the backyard of her father's home. Her father initially said he had seen her after lunch, although the precise timing of his statements later became part of the investigation. At some point after 4 p.m., he realized that his daughter was gone. Michelle had been wearing a pink and white polka dot bathing suit. Then she simply disappeared. There was no ransom call. There was no confirmed indication that she had voluntarily left. And there was no immediate explanation for how a 6-year-old girl could vanish from a familiar neighborhood without leaving behind a clear trail. The investigation began, but almost immediately it entered difficult territory. Police focused heavily on Michelle's father, Carl Dorr. That focus was not based on a single piece of evidence that conclusively established his guilt. Instead, investigators were troubled by inconsistencies in his statements and by other circumstances surrounding the disappearance. Carl was subjected to surveillance and questioning. Investigators examined financial records, telephone activity, rented videos, and people connected to him. At different points, Carl made statements claiming that he had harmed Michelle and buried her in different locations. Those statements were deeply disturbing, but they never resulted in Carl being prosecuted for Michelle's disappearance. For the purposes of this case, that distinction is essential. Suspicion surrounded him, but suspicion did not become a murder conviction. As investigators pursued those leads, Hadden Clark remained in the background. He lived close to the Dorr family. He knew people connected to Michelle, and through his brother's daughter, he had a connection to the 6-year-old girl herself. In other words, Clark was not an unknown person who appeared from nowhere. He was someone who existed within the wider circle surrounding Michelle. Yet in 1986, investigators did not have enough evidence to charge him. Michelle remained missing, and eventually the investigation became a long and painful unanswered question. 6 years passed. Then, in 1992, another disappearance occurred in Bethesda. This time, the missing woman was 23-year-old Laura Hodling. Laura had graduated from Harvard and had returned to live with her mother. Her family had previously employed Hadden Clark for gardening and other handyman work. Once again, Clark was not a complete outsider. He had already been within the family's environment. He knew the property. He knew the people. And after Laura disappeared from the home on October 19, 1992, investigators began to look closely at him. The circumstances were now different from Michelle's case. There was an established connection between the suspect and the missing woman, and investigators soon uncovered physical evidence that made that connection more significant. A bloody fingerprint belonging to Clark was found on a pillowcase associated with Laura. The investigation began to move toward him. Clark was questioned about Laura and about Michelle. He also provided information that investigators considered significant enough to lead them to search for remains in New Jersey, a state where he had lived when he was younger. That search produced nothing, but the investigation continued. Eventually, Clark admitted killing Laura Hodling. He led authorities to a shallow grave near Laura's home, where her body was recovered. In 1993, Clark pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The prosecution had initially faced a first-degree murder case, but ultimately accepted the second-degree plea because the available evidence was not considered sufficient to establish the malice and premeditation required for a first-degree murder conviction. On June 24, 1993, Clark received a 30-year sentence. At that point, one murder had been solved. One victim had been recovered. One family had an answer. But for investigators, another question remained. What had happened to Michelle Dorr? Laura's case had placed Haddon Clark inside another homicide investigation. It had also brought renewed attention to a disappearance that had remained unresolved since 1986. Michelle's body was still missing. The evidence surrounding her disappearance was incomplete. Investigators would have to return to old locations, reconsider old evidence, examine Clark's statements, and determine whether the suspicions surrounding him could withstand the standards required for a murder conviction. The search would eventually involve blood evidence, numerous knives, statements from people who had encountered Clark in prison, and renewed forensic testing. But even then, one fact remained painfully simple. Michelle Dorr had disappeared as a 6-year-old child, and for years there was no grave to visit, no confirmed place where her remains could be found, and no final physical answer to the question of what had happened to her. The case had begun with a child vanishing from a familiar neighborhood. It would eventually become connected to another homicide 6 years later. And the man standing at the center of both investigations would spend the rest of the story moving between the roles of suspect, convicted murderer, source of information, and ultimately the person who could lead investigators to the place where Michelle had been buried. But before that final discovery, there would be years of uncertainty. There would be evidence that raised questions without immediately answering them. There would be statements that had to be examined carefully. And there would be a trial in which prosecutors would attempt to prove a murder even though the victim's body had not yet been found. The story of Haddon Clark, then, is not simply the story of a murderer. It is the story of 2 victims, 2 investigations, and one connection that took years to become clear. Most importantly, it is the story of Michelle Dorr, a 6-year-old girl whose disappearance remained an unanswered question for almost 14 years, until the investigation finally returned to the place where the story had begun. Before Haddon Clark became the central figure in 2 homicide investigations, there were 2 people whose lives existed entirely apart from the headlines that would later surround their deaths. Michelle Dorr was 6 years old when she disappeared in 1986. Laura Hodling was 23 when she disappeared in 1992. They were separated by age, experience, and circumstance, and there is no reason to imagine that their lives would ever have crossed. Yet their names would eventually become linked through the actions of one man. To understand the case, it is important to begin with the victims rather than the offender. Michelle Dorr was a young child living with her father on Sudbury Road in Silver Spring, Maryland. At 6 years old, her world was defined by familiar places and familiar people. She was not living in isolation. She knew children in the neighborhood, including Elizabeth, the daughter of Haddon Clark's brother, Jeffrey. That connection is important because it helps explain why Clark could exist within the wider circle of people known to Michelle. He was not simply an unknown stranger passing through the neighborhood. He lived nearby, and his family was connected to people Michelle knew. But proximity alone is not proof of guilt. In 1986, investigators did not have enough evidence to establish that Clark had anything to do with Michelle's disappearance. The significance of that relationship would only become clear years later. On May 31, 1986, Michelle was at her father's home. According to the Maryland appellate record, she was last seen in the backyard. Her father initially said that he had seen her after lunch, although the precise timing of his statements later became part of the investigation. At some point after 4 p.m., he realized that Michelle was missing. She had been wearing a pink and white polka dot bathing suit. That small detail would become part of the permanent record of the case, because after that moment there was no confirmed sighting of her alive. There was no ransom demand. There was no established indication that she had simply decided to leave. There was no clear explanation for how a 6-year-old child could disappear from a familiar environment. For Michelle's family, the disappearance created a question that could not be answered. Where was she? What had happened to her? And who, if anyone, had taken her? The early investigation would become complicated by suspicion directed toward her father, Carl Dorr. Investigators were troubled by inconsistencies in his statements and pursued him as a possible suspect. He was subjected to surveillance and questioning, and police investigated aspects of his personal life, including financial records, telephone activity, rented videos, and people around him. Carl later made statements claiming that he had harmed Michelle and buried her in different locations. Those statements added another layer of uncertainty to an already painful investigation. Yet Carl Dorr was never prosecuted for Michelle's disappearance. That distinction remains essential. The investigation considered him, his statements were examined, and suspicion surrounded him, but no conviction established him as Michelle's killer. Meanwhile, another person remained connected to the case in a quieter way. Haddon Clark lived close to the Dorr family. Through his brother Jeffrey and Jeffrey's daughter Elizabeth, Clark had a connection to Michelle's social circle. He was therefore someone who could have been familiar to her. But at the time, that fact did not provide investigators with enough evidence to establish what, if anything, Clark had done. Michelle's disappearance eventually became a cold case. The years passed without a body and without a definitive answer. Then came Laura Hodling. Laura was 23 years old, a Harvard graduate who had returned to live with her mother in Bethesda. Her life was completely different from Michelle's, yet there was one crucial connection. Haddon Clark had previously worked for the Hodling family. He performed gardening and other handyman work for them, which meant that he was familiar with the family and their home. This was not a random encounter between an unknown offender and a stranger. Clark had already been allowed into the family's environment through his work. That relationship would become significant when Laura disappeared on October 19, 1992. Unlike Michelle, Laura was an adult with a life and history of her own. She had completed university and returned home, and her disappearance created a different investigative context. Clark was already someone known to the family, and investigators soon had a reason to examine him more closely. The prosecution later presented a theory about Clark's relationship with Laura's mother. According to that theory, Clark had developed an attachment to Laura's mother, and Laura's return home threatened that attachment. But this must be treated as a prosecutorial theory rather than an independently established fact. About Clark's inner thoughts, the evidence could demonstrate actions and circumstances. It could not necessarily reveal everything that was happening inside his mind. What investigators could examine more directly was physical evidence. A bloody fingerprint belonging to Clark was found on a pillowcase associated with Laura. That discovery changed the direction of the investigation. Clark was no longer simply a person who had worked for the family. He had become a significant suspect in Laura's disappearance. Investigators questioned him about Laura and also about Michelle. Clark provided information that caused authorities to search for remains in New Jersey, a state where he had lived when he was younger. The search did not locate Laura or Michelle, but the investigation continued, and eventually Clark admitted killing Laura Hodling. He led authorities to a shallow grave near Laura's home, where Laura's body was recovered. For her family, the disappearance had become a confirmed death. For investigators, the discovery established the physical reality of the crime and provided a direct connection between Clark and Laura's killing. It also created an unexpected bridge back to the older case. 6 years earlier, another person connected to a familiar environment had vanished. Michelle had been 6 years old. Laura had been 23. One disappeared from her father's home. The other disappeared from her mother's home. Their circumstances were different, but in both cases Clark had been within the surrounding circle of people. That connection would become impossible for investigators to ignore. Yet it is important not to reduce either victim to the circumstances of her death. Michelle was more than a missing child case file. Laura was more than a homicide investigation. Their names became associated with Clark only because their lives were tragically interrupted. The available record allows us to know certain things about them and their circumstances, but it does not allow us to invent private conversations, emotions, or moments that were never documented. The responsible way to tell this story is therefore to remain close to what can be established. Michelle was a 6-year-old girl who disappeared on May 31, 1986, from the neighborhood where she lived. Laura was a 23-year-old Harvard graduate who disappeared from her mother's home in Bethesda on October 19, 1992. Haddon Clark had connections to both environments, but those connections became meaningful only when later evidence began to accumulate. Laura's death would ultimately expose a man who had remained on the edges of the Michelle investigation, and Michelle's disappearance would force investigators to look backward, reconsider old evidence, and ask whether the man convicted in Laura's death had also been responsible for what happened to a child 6 years earlier. The answer would not come quickly. There would be no simple confession that immediately resolved everything, no body waiting to be discovered at the beginning of the investigation, and no single piece of evidence that explained the entire story. Instead, the case would unfold through fragments, relationships, statements, physical evidence, searches, and years of unanswered questions. At the center of those fragments were two victims whose lives had been cut short under very different circumstances. And as investigators followed the trail from Laura back to Michelle, the past would begin to emerge from the shadows of a case that had refused to disappear. May 31st, 1986 began as an ordinary day in Silver Spring, Maryland, but by the end of it, a 6-year-old girl named Michelle Dorr had disappeared. What followed was an investigation that would stretch across more than a decade, pass through conflicting statements and changing suspicions, and eventually return to a man who had lived close enough to Michelle that his name would never be entirely absent from the story. Yet in those first hours, investigators did not know any of that. They knew only that a child was missing. Michelle was at her father's home on Sudbury Road. According to the Maryland appellate record, she was last seen in the backyard. Her father initially stated that he had seen her after lunch, although the precise timing of his statements later became part of the investigation. At some point after 4 p.m., he realized that his daughter was gone. She had been wearing a pink and white polka dot bathing suit. That detail, seemingly small at the time, became one of the identifying details permanently associated with her disappearance. There was no ransom demand. There was no confirmed evidence that Michelle had decided to leave on her own. And there was no immediate explanation for how she could have vanished from an environment that should have been familiar to her. For investigators, the first task was to determine what had happened during the period between the last confirmed sighting and the moment her father realized she was missing. But as the investigation developed, attention increasingly turned toward the people closest to Michelle. Her father, Carl Dorr, became a major focus. The The reasons for that focus included inconsistencies in his statements and other circumstances that investigators considered suspicious. Police subjected him to surveillance and questioning. They examined financial records, telephone activity, rented videos, and people connected to him. The investigation became increasingly intrusive as authorities attempted to determine whether Michelle's disappearance could have been connected to her own family. This was a difficult direction for the case because the person being investigated was not an unknown outsider. He was Michelle's father. Yet investigators were dealing with a child who had disappeared without an obvious explanation, and they were trying to reconstruct events from incomplete information. Carl's behavior and statements added to the uncertainty. At different points, he told investigators that he had harmed Michelle and buried her in different locations. Those statements were deeply significant to investigators because they appeared to provide possible explanations for the disappearance. But they did not ultimately establish that Carl had killed his daughter. He was never prosecuted for Michelle's disappearance. That distinction is important because the early investigation illustrates how a missing person case can become divided between what investigators suspect and what they can actually prove. Michelle was still missing, and the statements pointing toward her father did not lead to a final resolution. As investigators continued working through the case, Haddon Clark was also present in the surrounding circumstances, although not yet as the central suspect he would later become. Clark lived close to the Dorr family. He was living with his brother Jeffrey Clark, and Michelle had a connection to Jeffrey's daughter, Elizabeth. Michelle and Elizabeth were friends, which meant that Clark was not simply an unknown adult from outside the neighborhood. He belonged to a circle of people familiar to the family. That fact would later become significant because it meant that Clark could have been known to Michelle rather than appearing as a complete stranger. But in 1986, proximity was not enough. Investigators did not have sufficient evidence to charge Clark with Michelle's disappearance. There was no established forensic chain connecting him to the crime. There was no recovered body. And there was no confirmed account demonstrating what he had done. His presence in the neighborhood was a fact, but what that presence meant remained unresolved. The investigation therefore continued without the certainty that investigators needed. The longer Michelle remained missing, the more difficult it became to reconstruct the exact circumstances of her disappearance. A missing child leaves behind a different kind of evidence from a confirmed homicide. Without a body, investigators had to work with sightings, statements, relationships, locations, and whatever physical evidence could still be recovered. Time itself became an obstacle. Every day that passed created greater distance between the investigators and the moment Michelle was last seen. Yet the case did not disappear completely. Michelle's name remained connected to an unanswered question. Where had she gone after being seen in the backyard? Who had last been with her? And if someone had taken her, why had there been so little evidence pointing clearly toward that person? The early investigation also demonstrated the difficulty of distinguishing between a person's suspicious behavior and proof of a crime. Carl Dorr's statements drew attention, but they did not result in prosecution. Clark's proximity was notable, but it did not produce a charge. The case therefore remained suspended between possibilities. Investigators had people to question, but no definitive explanation. They had statements, but not enough corroboration. They had a missing child, but no body. Years passed. The investigation eventually became a cold case. But Michelle's disappearance remained important because the basic question had never been answered. What had happened to her? For the people who had known her, the absence was not abstract. A 6-year-old child had been present, and then she was gone. Her disappearance became a permanent gap in the neighborhood's history. 6 years later, in 1992, that gap would begin to connect with another case. But in 1986, there was no way for investigators to know that. Haddon Clark would not yet be facing a murder charge. Laura Hodling was still alive. The evidence that would eventually place Clark at the center of 2 homicide investigations had not yet emerged. The future connection between the cases existed only as something that would become visible later. For Michelle's family, however, there was no later. There was only the continuing absence of a child. The investigation into her disappearance had initially moved toward her father, then struggled to establish what had happened, while Clark remained an individual in the surrounding environment whose significance had not yet been fully understood. Eventually, the investigation stalled. There was no recovery of Michelle's remains. There was no prosecution of Carl Dorr. There was no charge against Haddon Clark. There was no definitive account of the events of May 31st, 1986. The case entered the years in which a family can begin to measure time not by ordinary milestones, but by the fact that someone who should still be there is not. And that was the state of the Michelle Dorr investigation when the calendar moved forward into the 1990s. Then, 6 years after Michelle disappeared, another young woman vanished in Bethesda. Her name was Laura Hodling. She was 23 years old. She had graduated from Harvard and returned to live with her mother. And Haddon Clark, the man who had once lived near the Dorr family, was now connected to another family as well. He had worked for the Hodlings, performing gardening and handyman tasks. When Laura disappeared on October 19, 1992, investigators would begin examining Clark in a completely different context. This time, the investigation would not remain frozen around uncertainty for years. There would be physical evidence. There would be questioning. There would eventually be a confession and a recovered body. And as investigators began to unravel what had happened to Laura, they would also be forced to look backward toward the 6-year-old girl whose disappearance had remained unresolved since 1986. The second case would not erase the first. Instead, it would reopen it. But before that could happen, investigators first had to understand what had happened to Laura Hodling. The disappearance of Michelle Dorr had begun with a child vanishing from a familiar neighborhood. 6 years later, the disappearance of another woman would provide the first major break in the story. And the man who stood at the intersection of those two cases was Haddon Clark. 6 years had passed since Michelle Dorr disappeared when another disappearance brought Haddon Clark directly into the focus of investigators. The setting was Bethesda, Maryland, and the missing woman was 23-year-old Laura Hodling. Unlike Michelle, Laura was an adult, a Harvard graduate, and someone whose life had already taken her beyond the immediate world of childhood and neighborhood friendships. Yet there was one important connection between Laura's world and the man who had once lived near Michelle. Haddon Clark had previously worked for the Hodling family. He performed gardening and handyman work for them, which meant that he was not an unknown person who had appeared at their home without explanation. He had already been allowed into the family's environment. He knew the property. He knew the people. And when Laura disappeared on October 19, 1992, that previous familiarity would become one of the reasons investigators looked closely at him. Laura had graduated from Harvard and had returned to live with her mother. The prosecution would later present a theory about Clark's relationship with Laura's mother, suggesting that he had developed an attachment to her and that Laura's return home threatened that attachment. That theory would become part of the explanation offered for why Clark might have wanted Laura gone. But it is important to separate a prosecution theory from an established fact about another person's private thoughts. The available evidence could establish Clark's actions and his connections to the family. It could not necessarily reveal every emotion or motive that existed inside his mind. What investigators could establish more directly was that Laura had disappeared and that Clark had a connection to the household. The case therefore began with a question that investigators had faced before. Where had the missing person gone? But this time, the investigation would develop differently. In Michelle Dorr's case, the early investigation had become heavily focused on her father, and Clark had remained in the background. In Laura's case, Clark himself would become one of the central figures. The difference was not simply that investigators suspected him. There was physical evidence that helped bring the investigation toward him. A bloody fingerprint belonging to Clark was found on a pillowcase associated with Laura. That discovery gave investigators something tangible to examine. It did not by itself provide every answer about what had happened, but it connected Clark physically to an item associated with the missing woman and intensified the investigation into his involvement. Clark was questioned about Laura. He was also questioned about Michelle. The two cases, which had been separated by 6 years, were now beginning to occupy the same investigative space. Clark's responses and the information he provided became increasingly important. At one point, he gave investigators information that caused them to search for remains in New Jersey, a state where he had lived when he was younger. Investigators followed the lead and conducted a search, but no remains were found. That failure did not end the investigation. Instead, it demonstrated one of the difficulties that would repeatedly appear in the Clark case. Information could point investigators toward a location without necessarily producing physical confirmation. A search could be conducted, yet the answer could remain out of reach. Investigators therefore continued examining the evidence surrounding Laura's disappearance. The case was no longer simply about a woman who had vanished. It was increasingly about what Clark knew, what he had done, and whether his statements could be verified. Eventually, the investigation reached its first decisive breakthrough. Clark admitted killing Laura Hodling. The admission changed the nature of the case. Until then, investigators had been attempting to reconstruct Laura's disappearance from evidence and statements. Now they had a confession from the person they suspected. But even a confession did not end the investigation immediately. Authorities still needed to locate Laura's body. A missing person and a confirmed homicide are not the same thing, and investigators needed to establish where Laura was. Clark eventually led them to a shallow grave near Laura's home. There, authorities recovered her body. The recovery provided the physical resolution that the investigation had been seeking. Laura was no longer simply a missing woman. She had been killed, and her remains had been located. The discovery also strengthened the connection between Clark and the crime. In 1993, Clark pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in Laura's death. The legal outcome was significant because he had initially faced a first-degree murder charge, but the prosecution ultimately accepted the second-degree plea. The explanation provided was that the available evidence was not sufficient to establish the malice and premeditation required for first-degree murder. On June 14, 1993, Clark entered his guilty plea. 10 days later, on June 24, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The judge considered him a serious danger to the community and imposed the maximum sentence available for the offense at that time. With the conviction, the Laura Hodling case had reached a formal legal conclusion. But the investigation surrounding Haddon Clark was not finished. In fact, Laura's case had created a new and much more troubling question. What did Clark know about Michelle Dorr? The connection was difficult to ignore. In 1986, Michelle had disappeared from the area where Clark lived close to her family. She had known people connected to him through his brother's daughter. In 1992, Laura had disappeared from a household where Clark had previously worked. Now Clark had admitted killing Laura. He had led investigators to her body, and his name had once again appeared in connection with Michelle. For investigators, the older disappearance could no longer be viewed simply as an isolated cold case. There was now a convicted murderer in prison who had been part of the social environment surrounding Michelle years earlier. But suspicion was still not enough. Michelle's body had never been found. There was no complete physical chain connecting Clark to her disappearance. Investigators had to determine whether the evidence surrounding Michelle could meet the same legal standard that had been applied in Laura's case. The problem was enormous. Laura's case had produced a confession and a grave. Michelle's case still had neither a recovered body nor a definitive account of what had happened to her. The investigators would have to return to old evidence and old locations. They would have to examine statements Clark had made and determine whether they contained information only the killer could reasonably know. They would have to look at physical evidence that had been collected years earlier and ask whether Advances in forensic technology could reveal something that investigators in 1986 could not see. The case would eventually involve searches in Massachusetts. Blood evidence from the home where Clark had lived with his brother, dozens of knives found in stored property, and statements from people who encountered Clark while he was in prison. But none of that was immediately available as a complete explanation. The investigation would have to develop piece by piece. Laura's death had therefore done something more than solve a single homicide. It had reopened a question that had remained unanswered since 1986. Michelle Dorr was still missing, and now investigators had a reason to look more closely at a man who had been present in the surrounding circumstances of her disappearance. The passage of 6 years had not erased the old evidence. Instead, it had created an unexpected connection between two investigations. Laura's case became the doorway back into Michelle's. The person who had once been only a nearby figure in the investigation of a missing 6-year-old was now a convicted murderer. Yet the law still required more than suspicion. Investigators needed evidence capable of establishing that Clark had killed Michelle. That meant going back into the past and examining what remained. There would be no easy solution. The search for Michelle would continue while Clark was already serving a sentence for Laura's murder. Investigators would look for physical evidence, reconsider old locations, and examine what Clark had said to others. They would eventually revisit the home where he had lived in 1986 and discover blood evidence that raised new questions. They would recover 41 knives from stored property. They would hear accounts from prisoners who said Clark had spoken about Michelle. And by the late 1990s, improved forensic testing would give investigators another opportunity to examine evidence that had survived for more than a decade. But even as those pieces began to accumulate, one fact remained unchanged. Michelle's remains had not been found. The Laura Hodling case had provided the first major breakthrough, but it had not yet answered the oldest question. What had happened to Michelle Dorr on May 31, 1986? For almost 14 years, that question would remain at the center of the investigation. And as investigators followed the evidence, the story of the missing 6-year-old would slowly move from the uncertain territory of suspicion toward a case that could finally be brought before a jury. By the time Haddon Clark stood before a Maryland court in 1993, the disappearance of Laura Hodling had already taken investigators through a chain of uncertainty. Physical evidence, questioning, searches, and finally an admission. Laura was no longer simply a missing person. Her body had been recovered from a shallow grave near her home, and Clark had admitted killing her. But the legal process still had to determine what crime could be established beyond the circumstances surrounding her death. The distinction mattered because murder charges are not all treated the same way under the law. Clark initially faced a first-degree murder charge. The prosecution, however, ultimately accepted a plea to second-degree murder. The reason was not that investigators doubted that Laura had been killed. The evidence established that. The issue was whether the prosecution could prove the specific elements necessary for a first-degree murder conviction, particularly the malice and premeditation required for that level of offense. In the end, prosecutors concluded that the available evidence was not sufficient to establish those elements to the standard required in court. Clark therefore entered a plea to second-degree murder rather than proceeding to trial on the original first-degree charge. On June 14, 1993, he pleaded guilty. The plea represented a major legal conclusion to an investigation that had begun with Laura's disappearance on October 19, 1992. It also meant that the facts surrounding the homicide would not all be tested through a full first-degree murder trial. Instead, the court was presented with a defendant admitting responsibility for Laura's death and accepting punishment for second-degree murder. 10 days later, on June 24, 1993, Clark was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The sentence was the maximum punishment available for that offense at the time. The judge regarded Clark as a serious danger to the community. That assessment was important because the court was not treating the case as an ordinary act of violence whose consequences ended with the conviction. Clark had been convicted of killing a young woman whose body had been hidden near her own home, and the circumstances surrounding his conduct had demonstrated a serious threat to public safety. With the 30-year sentence imposed, the legal case involving Laura had reached its immediate conclusion. But the story surrounding Haddon Clark did not end with the sentence. In fact, the conviction created the circumstances under which investigators could return to an older disappearance that had never been resolved. Michelle Dorr had disappeared 6 years before Laura. She was only 6 years old. Her remains had never been found, and Clark's connection to her family had existed long before Laura Hodling entered the investigation. Now, investigators had something they had not possessed in 1986. A convicted murderer who had admitted killing another person and who had once been within Michelle's wider social environment. That did not automatically make Clark responsible for Michelle's disappearance. It did, however, give investigators a reason to revisit questions that had remained unanswered for years. The first question was proximity. Clark had lived close to the Dorr family and had been connected to Michelle through his brother Jeffrey's daughter, Elizabeth, who was Michelle's friend. That meant Clark could have been familiar to the child. The second question was opportunity. His proximity to the family meant that investigators could not simply dismiss the possibility that he had been able to encounter Michelle. But opportunity was not proof. The third question was evidence. Unlike Laura's case, investigators did not have Michelle's body. They did not have the same kind of direct resolution. They had to determine whether there was enough evidence to establish that Clark had killed her. That meant returning to material that had been collected years earlier and looking at it again. The passage of time presented a serious problem. Evidence deteriorates. Memories change. Statements become difficult to evaluate. Locations change. People who were once available to investigators may no longer be available in the same way. And in Michelle's case, the absence of a body meant that one of the most important pieces of physical evidence in a homicide investigation was missing entirely. Investigators nevertheless continued. They searched locations associated with Clark, including property connected to his family in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. Police used dogs and later radar in attempts to identify possible burial sites. Those searches did not locate Michelle's remains. The failure was significant, but it did not end the investigation. A negative search could establish that investigators had not found a body at a particular location. It could not establish that Michelle had never been there. The investigation, therefore, remained open to additional evidence. Investigators also returned to the home where Clark had lived with his brother in 1986. There, they found blood traces on the floor. More than 80 samples of human blood were submitted for testing during the investigation. At first glance, such evidence might appear decisive. But forensic evidence must be interpreted according to what it can actually establish. The samples were old, and investigators could not conclusively determine whose blood they represented. The presence of old blood therefore raised questions, but did not provide an immediate answer to the central question of whether Michelle had been killed there. This distinction became increasingly important as the case developed. The investigation was not built around one perfect piece of evidence. Instead, it gradually became a collection of circumstances that investigators would later present as part of a larger chain. Another piece of that chain emerged from Clark's stored property. In 1995, police found a large number of knives. 41 knives were eventually shown to the jury during the later proceedings. The discovery was disturbing in the context of the investigation, but again, possession was not the same as proof. There was no established evidence in the supplied records showing that a particular knife was the weapon used to kill Michelle. The knives, therefore, had to be considered as part of the broader evidence rather than as a definitive answer by themselves. At the same time, investigators began hearing accounts from people who had encountered Clark while he was incarcerated for Laura's murder. Some prisoners said that Clark had talked about Michelle. One of the most important accounts came from James Beckett, who later testified that Clark had told him he had killed Michelle. According to Beckett, Clark knew Michelle because she was friends with his niece. Beckett also said that Clark described the killing as something he had not originally intended to do. Such statements became important because they potentially connected Clark directly to Michelle's death. But they also had to be evaluated carefully. A prisoner's account of another prisoner's statements is not the same thing as physical evidence recovered from a crime scene. Investigators and prosecutors had to consider what was said, when it was said, and how reliable the account was. The value of such testimony would ultimately depend on how it fit with the other evidence. The investigation therefore continued to develop in layers. There was Clark's relationship to Michelle's family. There was his physical proximity to the Dorr home. There were the blood traces discovered years later. There were the knives found in storage. There were statements attributed to Clark by prisoners. There were searches that failed to locate Michelle. And there was the fact that Clark had already pleaded guilty to Laura's murder and had personally led investigators to Laura's body. None of these facts, taken individually, answered every question. Together, however, they gave investigators a basis for reopening the older case. By the middle of the 1990s, the investigation into Michelle had moved far beyond the uncertainty of 1986. Investigators were no longer simply asking whether Clark might have known something about her disappearance. They were attempting to determine whether the evidence could support a murder charge. The case was still missing one crucial element: Michelle herself. Her remains had not been recovered. But the investigation was beginning to demonstrate that the absence of a body did not necessarily mean the absence of a case. The question would become whether the accumulated evidence could establish a death and identify the person responsible beyond a reasonable doubt. As investigators continued examining the old evidence, developments in forensic technology offered another possibility. Material that had been collected years earlier could now potentially be examined using techniques unavailable when Michelle disappeared. By 1998, the investigation would reach another major turning point. Improved DNA testing would allow authorities to reconsider evidence connected to the old case, and Haddon Clark would once again face a murder charge. This time, however, the case would be different from the one involving Laura. There would be no recovered body waiting at the beginning of the prosecution. There would be no confession that immediately resolved the disappearance. Instead, prosecutors would have to construct their case from evidence accumulated across more than a decade. The legal question would be stark. Could a jury be convinced that Michelle Dorr had been murdered and that Haddon Clark was responsible, even though her remains had still not been found? By 1998, investigators believed the answer could be yes. The case that had begun with a missing 6-year-old in 1986 was about to enter a new stage. And this time, the evidence would be placed before a court. By the time the investigation into Michelle Dorr was reopened in earnest, more than a decade had passed since the 6-year-old girl disappeared from Silver Spring. The passage of time had changed almost everything surrounding the case except the central fact: Michelle was still missing. Her family still did not have a grave. Investigators still did not have a complete explanation for what had happened on May 31st, 1986. And Haddon Clark, who had once been only a nearby figure connected to Michelle's wider social circle, was now serving a prison sentence for the murder of Laura Hodling. That conviction did not automatically establish Clark's responsibility for Michelle, but it gave investigators a new reason to examine the old case with greater attention. The first challenge was the absence of Michelle's remains. In many homicide investigations, a recovered body provides investigators with an enormous amount of information. It can establish that a death occurred, help determine the circumstances surrounding it, and provide physical evidence that can be compared with other evidence. In Michelle's case, none of that was available. For years, investigators had to work without knowing where she was. The searches therefore became an important part of the renewed investigation. Authorities examined locations associated with Clark, including property connected to his family in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. Police used search dogs and later radar in an attempt to identify places where remains might have been buried. These searches were significant because they represented attempts to find a physical answer to the disappearance, but they did not produce the result investigators wanted. Michelle was not found. A failed search could not establish what had happened to her. It could only establish that investigators had not located her remains at the places they examined. The case therefore continued to depend heavily on other forms of evidence. Investigators also returned to the home where Clark had lived with his brother in 1986. This location was important because it placed the investigation physically back in the period when Michelle disappeared. During the renewed examination, investigators found traces of blood on the floor. The discovery immediately raised questions about whether the blood could have any connection to Michelle. More than 80 samples of human blood were collected and submitted for testing during the investigation. But the age of the evidence created a serious limitation. The samples were old, and investigators could not conclusively determine whose blood they represented. That meant the blood evidence could not simply be presented as proof that Michelle had been killed. It was evidence that required interpretation, and its limitations had to be recognized. In a case already complicated by the absence of a body, that distinction was critical. A stain could be suspicious without revealing whose blood it was. A location could be relevant without proving that a murder had occurred there. The investigation therefore continued to accumulate evidence while still lacking a single definitive physical answer. Another development came in 1995, when investigators recovered a large collection of knives from Clark's stored property. 41 knives were eventually presented to the jury in the later proceedings. The number was striking, particularly because some accounts from people who had encountered Clark in prison connected him to statements about killing Michelle with a knife. But the presence of knives did not, by itself, establish that one of them had been used in Michelle's death. There was no confirmed identification of a particular knife as the murder weapon in the supplied record. That distinction mattered. Investigators could document what they found, prosecutors could present it as part of the broader circumstances, and a jury could consider it alongside other evidence. But the knives could not simply be transformed into proof that a specific weapon had killed Michelle. The renewed investigation was therefore becoming a case built from accumulation rather than a single dramatic discovery. Clark's own words would become another important part of that accumulation. While serving his sentence for Laura Hodling's murder, Clark spoke with other prisoners about Michelle. Some prisoners later claimed that he had admitted killing her. One of the most significant accounts came from James Beckett. Beckett told investigators that Clark had said he killed Michelle and that Clark knew the child because she was friends with his niece. Beckett also described Clark as saying that the killing was not something he had originally intended to do. If accurate, such a statement would be highly significant because it would place Clark himself at the center of Michelle's death. But there was an obvious limitation. The information came through another prisoner rather than from a physical object recovered from the crime scene. That meant investigators had to consider credibility and corroboration. The statement could not simply stand alone. It had to be considered within the larger body of evidence surrounding the disappearance. The case was therefore becoming a complicated combination of circumstances. There was the relationship between Clark and Michelle's family. There was his proximity to the Dorr residence. There was his connection to Michelle through his brother's daughter. There were the blood traces discovered at the home where he had lived in 1986. There were the knives recovered from his stored property. There were the statements attributed to him by prisoners. And there was the fact that he had already admitted killing Laura and had led investigators to her body. Yet Michelle herself was still absent from the equation. Investigators still had to establish what had happened to her. The case could not simply rely on the assumption that because Clark had killed Laura, he must also have killed Michelle. The two cases had to be proved separately. That separation is essential to understanding what happened next. A person can be convicted of one homicide without being responsible for another. The investigation into Michelle, therefore, had to stand on its own evidence. By 1998, advances in forensic technology provided investigators with another opportunity to examine material connected to the old case. Evidence that had been collected years earlier could now be subjected to improved DNA testing. The renewed forensic examination became a significant development because the investigators were no longer limited to the techniques available in 1986. In September 1998, Clark was charged in connection with Michelle's death. The charge represented a major turning point. For 12 years, Michelle's disappearance had remained unresolved. Now prosecutors were preparing to present the case as a homicide. But the most obvious problem remained. Michelle's body had still not been found. This meant the prosecution would have to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence. The legal question was no longer simply whether investigators believed Clark had killed Michelle. They had to present evidence capable of convincing a jury that she had died and that Clark was responsible for her death. The evidence would include the history of the relationship between Clark and Michelle's family, his proximity to her, the statements attributed to him, the physical evidence recovered during the renewed investigation, and the results of forensic examination. Each piece had its own limitations. The blood could not conclusively be identified. The knives could not be tied to the killing simply because Clark possessed them. Prison testimony required evaluation, and there was no body. Yet the prosecution believed that the combined evidence was sufficient to move forward. The case illustrated the difference between a missing person investigation and a homicide. Prosecution. For years, investigators had been trying to find Michelle. Now they were attempting to establish what had happened to her without physically having her. Remains. The absence of a body did not necessarily make prosecution impossible, but it made the evidentiary burden especially important. Everything that could connect Clark to Michelle's death had to be examined carefully. By the late 1990s, the investigation had moved far beyond the initial suspicions of 1986. The focus was no longer primarily on Michelle's father, Carl Dorr. Carl had never been prosecuted for the disappearance. Instead, the investigation had gradually shifted toward Clark, whose later conviction for Laura's murder had provided investigators with a new context in which to reconsider the older case. The years had not produced a single perfect piece of evidence. They had produced fragments. Some were physical, some were testimonial, some were based on Clark's own statements and actions, and some remained uncertain. The task of the prosecution would be to bring those fragments together without overstating what any individual piece could prove. In September 1998, the decision to charge Clark formally transformed the old disappearance into a criminal prosecution. Michelle had been missing since she was 6 years old. Now, more than 12 years later, the state was alleging that she had been murdered. But the ultimate test would take place in court. Clark would face a jury without Michelle's body available as evidence. Prosecutors would have to tell the story of a child who disappeared in 1986 and explain why they believe Haddon Clark was responsible. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the evidence and the reliability of the testimony surrounding it, and the jury would have to decide whether the accumulated evidence was strong enough to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The investigation had finally reached the point where suspicion would have to become proof. But even after the charge was filed, one question remained unanswered outside the courtroom. Where was Michelle Dorr? The answer would not come until after the conviction. For the moment, investigators had to proceed without her remains. The case that had survived 12 years of uncertainty was entering its most consequential stage. The evidence would be examined. The witnesses would be heard. And for the first time, the disappearance of a 6-year-old girl would be placed before a jury as a murder case. By the time Haddon Clark was charged in connection with Michelle Dorr's death in September 1998, investigators had spent more than 12 years trying to understand what had happened to a 6-year-old child who had disappeared without leaving behind a clear explanation. The case had changed dramatically since 1986. The initial suspicion surrounding Michelle's father, Carl Dorr, had not resulted in a prosecution. Clark, who had lived near the Dorr family and had been connected to Michelle through his brother's daughter, had eventually become the focus of a much larger investigation after the murder of Laura Hodling in 1992. Clark had pleaded guilty to Laura's murder, led investigators to her body, and received a 30-year sentence. But the Laura case, although legally resolved, had left investigators with an older and more difficult question. Was Clark also responsible for Michelle? The answer could not simply be assumed. The two cases had to be considered separately. The investigation into Michelle, therefore, depended on evidence that could connect Clark specifically to her disappearance and death. Some of that evidence came from the physical investigation. Some came from statements made by Clark himself or attributed to him by other prisoners. And some emerged from the reevaluation of evidence collected years earlier. Together, these developments would move the case toward prosecution. One of the most significant sources of information came from Clark's time in prison. While serving his sentence for Laura Hodling's murder, Clark spoke with other inmates about Michelle. Several prisoners later claimed that he had discussed her disappearance and, according to their accounts, admitted that he had killed her. These statements became important because they potentially provided something the investigators had lacked for years: a direct connection between Clark's own words and Michelle's death. One prisoner in particular, James Beckett, became an important witness. Beckett told investigators that Clark had said he killed Michelle. According to Beckett, Clark knew the child because she was friends with his niece. That detail was significant because it corresponded with an already established fact about the relationship between Michelle and Clark's family. Michelle had been friends with Elizabeth, the daughter of Clark's brother Jeffrey. Clark therefore had a connection to the child that did not depend upon a chance encounter. Beckett also said that Clark described the killing as something he had not originally intended to do. That statement, if accepted as truthful, would provide a possible explanation for how a child known within a family circle could have become a victim. But prisoner testimony always requires careful examination. The person reporting the statement is not necessarily a witness to the crime itself. Beckett had not been present when Michelle disappeared. His evidence concerned what he said Clark had told him later. That meant investigators and prosecutors had to consider the reliability of the account and how it fit with other evidence. The statement was therefore important, but it was not enough by itself to resolve every question. It became one part of a larger evidentiary picture. That picture also included the physical evidence recovered during renewed searches. Investigators had examined the home where Clark had lived with his brother in 1986 and discovered traces of blood on the floor. More than 80 samples of human blood were submitted for testing. The discovery raised obvious questions because the location was associated with Clark during the period when Michelle disappeared. But the forensic evidence had limitations. The samples were old, and investigators could not conclusively determine whose blood they represented. The blood, therefore, could not simply be described as Michelle's blood. It could not provide a definitive answer about what happened inside that home. Its significance depended on the broader investigation. The same principle applied to the knives recovered from Clark's stored property. In 1995, investigators found 41 knives, and those knives were later shown to the jury. Their presence became part of the prosecution's broader presentation. Yet possession of knives was not proof that any particular knife had been used to kill Michelle. No individual weapon could be conclusively identified in the supplied record as the murder weapon. The evidence had to be treated within its limits. The investigation was therefore not a story in which one spectacular forensic discovery suddenly solved the case. Instead, it was a gradual process in which different pieces of information began to point in the same direction. The relationship between Clark and Michelle's family was one piece. His proximity to the door home was another. The blood evidence was another. The knives were another. The statements attributed to him by prisoners were another. And Clark's conviction and confession in Laura's case provided additional context, although it could not legally substitute for evidence concerning Michelle. Investigators also continued searching for Michelle's remains. Locations associated with Clark were examined, including property belonging to his family in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. Police used dogs and later radar in attempts to identify possible burial sites. Nothing was found. That failure was significant because the absence of a body remained the greatest physical obstacle in the case. Without Michelle's remains, investigators could not rely on the direct evidence that a recovered body can provide. They had to build a case through other means. Then, in the late 1990s, advances in forensic technology offered another opportunity. Evidence that had been collected years earlier could be examined with improved DNA testing technique. The passage of time had not erased every piece of physical evidence. Some material had survived long enough to be reconsidered using methods that were more advanced than those available when Michelle disappeared. The renewed testing became part of the investigative effort that ultimately led authorities to charge Clark. In September 1998, he was formally charged in connection with Michelle's death. The significance of that moment is difficult to overstate. For more than a decade, Michelle's disappearance had remained a question without a criminal conviction attached to it. Now the state was formally alleging that she had been murdered and that Haddon Clark was responsible. Yet even then, the most important physical fact remained unchanged. Michelle's body had not been found. The prosecution would therefore have to rely on a combination of circumstantial evidence and testimony. The case would require investigators and prosecutors to demonstrate that Michelle was dead, that her death resulted from a criminal act, and that Clark was the person responsible. The fact that Clark had already been convicted of Laura's murder could not, by itself, prove that he had killed Michelle. A previous conviction does not automatically establish responsibility for another crime. The Michelle case had to stand on its own evidence. This distinction was especially important because the investigation contained both strong and uncertain elements. Clark's relationship to Michelle was established. His proximity to the family was established. His connection through his brother's daughter was established. The blood samples existed, but their source could not be conclusively identified. The knives existed, but no particular weapon had been established as the murder weapon. Prisoners provided accounts of statements Clark allegedly made, but those accounts had to be evaluated. Searches had been conducted, but they had failed to recover Michelle. The prosecution, therefore, had to construct a coherent chain from these individual pieces without claiming that any one of them proved more than it actually did. This was the challenge that confronted the investigators as the case moved toward trial. The years of uncertainty had produced evidence. But evidence is only useful if it can be connected into a convincing explanation. The question for the jury would not simply be whether Clark was a suspicious man or whether he had committed another murder. The question would be whether the evidence established beyond a reasonable doubt that he had killed Michelle Dorr. By September 1998, authorities believed they had enough to bring that allegation into court. For Michelle's family, the charge represented a new stage in a case that had remained unresolved since 1986. But it was not yet the end. A charge is an accusation, not a verdict. The evidence still had to survive courtroom scrutiny. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's case, and the jury would have to determine whether the accumulated evidence was sufficient for a conviction. The most extraordinary aspect of the coming trial was that Michelle's body would still be missing. The state would be asking a jury to find a man guilty of murdering a child whose remains had not yet been recovered. That circumstance made every other piece of evidence more important. The testimony of people who claimed Clark had spoken about Michelle would have to be considered. carefully. The physical evidence would have to be placed in context. The relationship between Clark and Michelle would have to be explained, and the prosecution would have to demonstrate that the entire chain of circumstances pointed toward one conclusion. The investigation had begun with a child disappearing from a backyard. It had passed through years of uncertainty, a separate homicide, searches, old blood evidence, knives, prison conversations, and renewed forensic examination. By 1998, investigators were finally ready to ask a court to decide what they believed had happened. But the final answer to the oldest question was still missing. Where was Michelle Dorr? The case would soon proceed without that answer. The trial would have to establish the reality of her death before investigators could ever recover the physical remains that would later complete the story. The conviction of Haddon Clark by 1999. The disappearance of Michelle Dorr had become a case that seemed almost impossible to resolve. More than 12 years had passed since the 6-year-old girl vanished from her father's home in Silver Spring, Maryland. Investigators had followed different possibilities, examined people close to Michelle, searched locations associated with Haddon Clark, recovered physical evidence, and listened to accounts of statements Clark had allegedly made while in prison. Yet one of the most fundamental pieces of evidence was still missing: Michelle herself. Her remains had not been recovered. That fact shaped everything about the prosecution that followed. When Haddon Clark went to trial in 1999, the state was asking a jury to accept that Michelle Dorr had been murdered and that Clark was responsible, despite the absence of a body. The prosecution, therefore, had to rely on the evidence that remained after more than a decade. The case was not based on one isolated discovery. It was constructed from a collection of circumstances and testimony that investigators believed, when considered together, established Clark's responsibility. The history connecting Clark to Michelle was an important part of that story. Clark had lived near the Dorr family in 1986. He was living with his brother Jeffrey Clark, whose daughter Elizabeth was a friend of Michelle. That relationship meant Clark was not an unknown stranger in the child's environment. He was someone whose family was connected to Michelle's social world. The prosecution could therefore place him within the circumstances surrounding her disappearance. But proximity alone could not prove murder. The state also had to address the evidence that had emerged during the years after Michelle vanished. One part of that evidence involved the home where Clark had lived with his brother. Investigators had found traces of human blood on the floor and submitted more than 80 blood samples for examination. The evidence was potentially significant because it came from a location associated with Clark during the period of Michelle's disappearance. Yet the samples had a major limitation. Investigators could not conclusively determine whose blood they represented. The prosecution could not simply tell the jury that the blood was Michelle's. It remained evidence whose significance had to be considered in combination with everything else. Another piece of evidence involved the knives discovered in Clark's stored property in 1995. 41 knives were eventually presented to the jury. The sheer number was striking, but again, the evidence had to be kept within its limits. There was no established proof in the supplied record that one specific knife was the weapon used to kill Michelle. The knives could therefore contribute to the circumstances presented by prosecutors, but they could not independently establish the murder. The testimony concerning Clark's conversations in prison was potentially more direct. James Beckett told investigators that Clark had admitted killing Michelle. According to Beckett, Clark knew Michelle because she was friends with his niece. Beckett also said that Clark had described the killing as something he had not originally intended to do. For prosecutors, such testimony could be significant because it purported to contain an admission by the defendant himself. It also corresponded with the established connection between Michelle and Clark's family. But the testimony remained subject to the ordinary demands of a criminal trial. Beckett had not witnessed Michelle's disappearance. His account concerned what he said Clark had told him while they were incarcerated. The jury therefore had to decide how much weight to give that evidence. The prosecution's task was to demonstrate that these different pieces of information were not isolated coincidences, but parts of a single explanation. The defense, in turn, could challenge the reliability and meaning of the evidence. The blood could not be conclusively identified. The knives could not be conclusively linked to the killing. Prison testimony had to be assessed for credibility, and Michelle's body remained absent. Those limitations made the trial particularly important. The jury was not being asked to decide whether Clark was a suspicious individual, nor could his conviction for Laura Hodling's murder automatically establish his guilt in Michelle's case. The prosecution had to prove this homicide separately. That distinction is essential when looking at the case historically. Clark had already pleaded guilty to killing Laura in 1993, but the Michelle prosecution was a separate proceeding involving a separate victim and a separate set of facts. His earlier conviction could provide context, but it could not simply replace the evidence required for the Michelle case. The trial therefore focused on whether the evidence surrounding Michelle was sufficient to establish Clark's guilt. The prosecution presented the circumstances of Michelle's disappearance, the relationship between Clark and the child, the physical evidence recovered during the renewed investigation, and the accounts of people who said Clark had spoken about the killing. The case also reflected the results of the renewed forensic investigation. By the late 1990s, improved DNA technology had allowed authorities to reconsider evidence connected to the old investigation. That development had helped move the case toward formal charges in 1998. Yet even with advances in forensic science, there was no simple laboratory result that could replace the missing body. The case remained one in which the jury had to evaluate a chain of evidence rather than a single definitive piece. During the proceedings, the absence of Michelle's remains inevitably remained an important fact. For more than 12 years, her family had lived without knowing where she was. Now the state was attempting to establish in court that she had been murdered. The lack of a body meant that the prosecution had to rely on circumstances surrounding the disappearance and the evidence accumulated afterward. It also meant that the eventual verdict would have an unusual significance. A conviction would establish legally that Michelle had been killed and that Clark was responsible, even though investigators still did not know where her remains were. The jury ultimately found Haddon Clark guilty of Michelle Dorr's murder. The conviction represented a major turning point in a case that had begun in 1986. For the first time, there was a judicial determination that Michelle's disappearance was the result of murder and that Clark was the person responsible. Yet the conviction did not immediately answer every question. The location of Michelle's remains was still unknown. The family had a verdict, but not a grave. Investigators had a convicted killer, but they still did not know where he had buried the child. That distinction would remain painfully important. A criminal conviction can establish responsibility without necessarily revealing every detail of a crime. In Michelle's case, the unanswered question was physical and deeply personal. Where could her family finally find her? Clark's conviction meant that investigators no longer needed to establish whether he had killed Michelle before moving forward. The legal system had answered that question. What remained was the search for her remains. Clark, now convicted in connection with both Laura Hodling and Michelle Dorr, became the person who potentially possessed the final piece of information necessary to locate her. The investigation therefore entered another stage. Authorities could continue searching independently, but they also had the possibility of obtaining information directly from Clark. The man who had once led investigators to Laura's shallow grave might know where Michelle had been buried as well. The conviction changed the balance of the investigation. Before the trial, investigators had been trying to prove that Clark was responsible. After the verdict, that question had been settled in court. The next question was where Michelle was. For her family, the difference was enormous. A verdict could provide legal accountability, but it could not replace the need to recover a missing child. The search for Michelle therefore continued beyond the courtroom. Clark eventually cooperated with authorities and provided information about a location near Route 29 in Silver Spring. That development would come after the conviction and would finally lead investigators to the remains that had eluded them for almost 14 years. But in the immediate aftermath of the 1999 verdict, Michelle was still missing. Her name had been spoken in court, evidence concerning her disappearance had been examined, and a jury had found Clark guilty. Yet the physical reality of her death remained hidden beneath the ground somewhere in Maryland. The case had achieved a legal conclusion before it achieved a physical one. That sequence is one of the most unusual aspects of the Hadden-Clark investigation. In many homicide cases, the discovery of remains leads investigators toward a suspect and eventually toward a conviction. Here, the order was reversed. Clark was convicted first. Michelle would be found afterward. For nearly 14 years, her disappearance had been defined by uncertainty. Now the uncertainty had narrowed to one final question. Where had Clark left her? The answer would arrive in January 2000, when Clark finally led investigators to a wooded area near Route 29 in Silver Spring. There, after years of searching and more than a decade of unanswered questions, investigators would finally find what Michelle's family had been waiting for: her remains. The conviction had established what had happened to her. The discovery would finally establish where she was. The search for Michelle and the discovery of her remains after Hadden-Clark was convicted of murdering Michelle Dorr in 1999. One of the most important questions in the case remained unanswered. The jury had determined that Clark was responsible for Michelle's death, but investigators still did not know where her remains were. For Michelle's family, the conviction provided an answer to one question, but left another painfully unresolved. Their daughter had been missing since May 31, 1986. More than 13 years had passed since the afternoon when she disappeared from her father's home on Sudbury Road. Now the legal system had established that she had been murdered, yet there was still no place where her family could go to remember her. There was no grave. There was no confirmed location connected to her final resting place. The investigation therefore continued even after the courtroom had delivered its verdict. The circumstances were unusual. In many homicide investigations, investigators find a body first and use the evidence surrounding the remains to establish what happened. In Michelle's case, the sequence had been reversed. Clark had been convicted without the discovery of her body. That meant the next stage of the investigation depended heavily on information that could potentially come from Clark himself. He was now serving sentences for the murders of both Laura Hodling and Michelle Dorr. Investigators had already learned that he could provide information about locations connected with the crimes. In Laura's case, he had eventually led authorities to a shallow grave near her home. That history made his cooperation potentially important in Michelle's case. But investigators still had to determine whether the information he provided was accurate and whether it could lead them to a specific location. Earlier searches had already demonstrated how difficult that task could be. Authorities had examined locations associated with Clark, including property belonging to his family in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. Search dogs had been used, and radar was later employed in attempts to identify possible burial sites. Those searches had failed to locate Michelle. The absence of remains had therefore continued even after investigators had developed serious suspicions about Clark. Now, however, the legal status of the case had changed. There was no longer an unresolved question of whether Clark could be prosecuted. He had already been convicted. The remaining goal was recovery. At some point after his conviction, Clark provided authorities with information that led them toward a wooded area near Route 29 in Silver Spring. The location was significant because it was in the broader area associated with Michelle's disappearance. Investigators followed the information and searched the area. On January 7, 2000, Clark led police to a place described in the Maryland appellate record as a wooded ravine or area near Route 29. There, authorities discovered Michelle's remains. After almost 14 years, the the search was finally over. The discovery brought a physical conclusion to a disappearance that had begun with almost no clear evidence of what had happened. Michelle was no longer a missing child whose fate had to be reconstructed from statements and circumstances. Her remains had been located, and the conviction of Haddon Clark now had a physical reality connected to it. For investigators, the discovery represented the final major step in a case that had moved through several different stages. In 1986, Michelle disappeared. The initial investigation focused heavily on her father, Carl Dorr, whose statements and behavior had caused investigators to suspect him. Yet he was never prosecuted. Clark remained in the surrounding environment, but there was not enough evidence to charge him. The case eventually became a cold case. In 1992, Laura Hodling disappeared, and Clark's connection to her family brought him directly into another homicide investigation. A bloody fingerprint on a pillowcase associated with Laura became an important physical clue. Clark eventually admitted killing Laura and led authorities to her body. In 1993, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and received a 30-year sentence. His conviction then provided investigators with a new reason to reconsider Michelle's disappearance. Over the following years, investigators searched locations, examined old blood evidence, recovered dozens of knives, and collected accounts from prisoners who said Clark had spoken about Michelle. By 1998, Clark was charged with Michelle's murder. In 1999, he was convicted even though her body had not yet been found. And finally, in January 2000, the missing physical evidence was recovered. The sequence illustrates how a long investigation can change direction over time. At the beginning, investigators did not have enough evidence to know who was responsible. Later, they had a suspect, but not enough evidence for prosecution. Then a second homicide created a new connection. After that, investigators returned to the older case with new forensic techniques and new testimony. The conviction followed. Only afterward did investigators obtain the information necessary to locate Michelle's remains. Each stage depended on the previous one. Yet it is also important to recognize what the discovery did not do. It did not transform every earlier suspicion into fact. The evidence concerning Carl Dorr remained what it had always been, an investigative episode that never resulted in his prosecution. The searches in Massachusetts remained unsuccessful. The blood samples collected from the old residence did not become conclusively identified as Michelle's blood simply because her remains were later recovered. The knives remained evidence considered during the investigation, but no specific knife was established in the supplied record as the murder weapon. And the prison statements remained testimony about what Clark allegedly said. The discovery of Michelle's remains provided the physical resolution to the disappearance, but it did not erase the importance of distinguishing confirmed facts from unresolved claims. That distinction is especially important in a case that has accumulated stories over many years. Haddon Clark has sometimes been described in popular accounts as a serial killer or associated with additional disappearances, but the established convictions concern two murders, Michelle Dorr and Laura Hodling. Other alleged connections must be treated separately unless they were proven. The recovery of Michelle therefore marks the end of one investigation, not proof of every allegation that has ever been associated with Clark's name. For Michelle's family, however, the discovery had a meaning that went beyond legal classifications. For almost 14 years, they had lived with uncertainty. They knew Michelle had disappeared, but they did not know where she was. The absence of remains meant that there was no confirmed place to mourn her. When investigators finally located her, that uncertainty ended. The discovery could not undo the loss. It could not return the 6-year-old girl who had disappeared in 1986. But it provided the physical answer that had been missing for so long. The investigation could finally establish not only that Michelle had been murdered, but where her remains had been left. The location near Route 29 also brought the case back to the geography of the community where Michelle had lived. The disappearance had begun in Silver Spring, and after years of searching across different locations and following different leads, the final discovery was made in the same broader area. The case had traveled through courtrooms, prisons, investigations, forensic laboratories, and searches far from Maryland, yet its final physical answer was found close to where Michelle's life had begun. The recovery also demonstrated the complicated relationship between a criminal conviction and the recovery of a victim. Clark's conviction in 1999 was legally sufficient to establish his guilt, even though Michelle's remains had not yet been located. The discovery in 2000 did not create the conviction, it followed it. Instead, it gave investigators and Michelle's family something that the verdict alone could not provide. It gave them the opportunity to know where she had been. The case of Michelle Dorr therefore reached its most important resolution in stages. First came the recognition that her disappearance was a homicide. Then came the conviction of the person responsible. Finally came the discovery of her remains. Those three developments occurred separately, years apart, and each answered a different question. What had happened? Who was responsible? Where was Michelle? The final answer came nearly 14 years after the day she disappeared. By January 2000, the long search for Michelle Dorr had ended. Haddon Clark had been convicted of her murder, and investigators had recovered her remains. The case that had begun with a 6-year-old girl vanishing from a familiar neighborhood had finally reached a point at which the basic facts could be stated with certainty. Michelle had been murdered, Clark had been held legally responsible, and Michelle had finally been found. But the story of Haddon Clark still required one final examination. 2 victims had been established in court. 2 families had been permanently changed, and the case had generated years of speculation about whether Clark might have been responsible for other crimes. To understand the significance of the case, it was necessary to separate what had been proven from what remained unproven. The final chapter would therefore not be about expanding the legend surrounding Clark. It would be about examining the consequences of the convictions, the distinction between fact and suspicion, and what the case ultimately reveals about the long, uncertain process of solving a homicide. Consequences, unanswered questions, and the facts that remain. Haddon Clark's story ends not with a dramatic revelation, but with something more complicated: 2 convictions, 2 victims, and a clear boundary between what the evidence established and what remains uncertain. By January 2000, the central question surrounding Michelle Dorr had finally been answered. Michelle, a 6-year-old girl who disappeared from Silver Spring on May 31, 1986, had been murdered. Haddon Clark was convicted of her murder, and after years in which investigators searched without success, Clark led authorities to the place where her remains had been left. The recovery of Michelle brought a physical conclusion to a case that had remained unresolved for nearly 14 years. But the broader story of Haddon Clark is often presented in a way that can blur the difference between proven crimes and suspected ones. That distinction matters. The facts established through the legal process concern 2 victims, Michelle Dorr and Laura Hodling. Clark was convicted in connection with both deaths. Other stories and suspicions have circulated around his name, but they should not be presented as established murders unless there is evidence or a conviction confirming them. The temptation in a case like this is to measure its significance by the number of victims that might possibly be connected to the offender. But the documented history is already disturbing without adding speculation. 2 lives were taken. 2 families were changed permanently. And in both cases, Clark was ultimately held legally responsible. The first victim, Michelle Dorr, was 6 years old. Her disappearance in 1986 began an investigation filled with uncertainty. Her father, Carl Dorr, became an early focus of suspicion. Investigators examined his statements, monitored him, and pursued different aspects of his life. At one point, he made statements claiming that he had harmed Michelle and buried her in different locations. Yet those statements never resulted in a prosecution, and Carl Dorr was never convicted of Michelle's death. The eventual investigation moved in another direction. Haddon Clark had lived near the Dorr family and was connected to Michelle through his brother's daughter, Elizabeth, who was Michelle's friend. In 1986, however, that connection was not enough to establish his guilt. The case remained unresolved for years. It was only after Laura Hodling disappeared in 1992 that Clark became the subject of a homicide investigation that would eventually transform the older case. Laura was 23 years old and had graduated from Harvard. She had returned to live with her mother in Bethesda. Clark had previously worked for the Hodling family, performing gardening and handyman tasks. His familiarity with the household placed him within the circumstances surrounding Laura's disappearance. A bloody fingerprint belonging to Clark was found on a pillowcase associated with Laura. Investigators questioned him, searched locations based on information he provided, and eventually obtained his admission that he had killed Laura. Most importantly, Clark led authorities to a shallow grave near her home, where Laura's body was recovered. In 1993, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. The prosecution had originally considered first-degree murder, but ultimately concluded that the available evidence did not sufficiently establish the malice and premeditation required for that charge. On June 14, 1993, Clark entered his guilty plea. On June 24, he received a 30-year sentence, the maximum punishment available for that offense at the time. The judge considered him a serious danger to the community. That conviction closed the legal chapter on Laura's murder, but it opened another. Investigators now had reason to look again at Michelle Dorr's disappearance. Clark was already a convicted murderer. He had been connected to another family in circumstances that had ended in homicide, and his earlier connection to Michelle's family could no longer be dismissed as an insignificant coincidence. But investigators still had to prove the Michelle case separately. They searched locations associated with Clark, including property in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. Dogs and radar were used in attempts to locate possible burial sites. But those searches did not recover Michelle. Investigators also examined the home where Clark had lived with his brother in 1986. More than 80 samples of human blood were submitted for testing, but the age of the evidence prevented investigators from conclusively identifying whose blood it was. 41 knives recovered from Clark's stored property were later shown to the jury. Yet no specific knife was established in the supplied record as the weapon used to kill Michelle. These limitations are important because they demonstrate that the case was not solved by one perfect piece of forensic evidence. It was built from multiple elements that had to be considered together. Prison testimony became another part of the investigation. James Beckett said Clark had told him that he killed Michelle. According to Beckett, Clark knew Michelle because she was friends with his niece. Such testimony was potentially significant because it attributed an admission directly to Clark. But it was still testimony from another prisoner about statements Clark allegedly made, rather than eyewitness evidence of the murder itself. The credibility and meaning of those statements had to be evaluated. Advances in DNA testing also gave investigators an opportunity to reconsider evidence from the old investigation. By September 1998, Clark was charged with Michelle's murder. The case proceeded despite the fact that Michelle's body had still not been found. That was a crucial feature of the prosecution. The state had to demonstrate through the accumulated evidence that Michelle had been murdered and that Clark was responsible. In 1999, the jury found Clark guilty. The conviction established the legal conclusion that Michelle had been murdered by Clark even though her remains had not yet been recovered. Only afterward did the final physical piece of the investigation emerge. On January 7, 2000, Clark led authorities to a wooded area near Route 29 in Silver Spring. Michelle's remains were found there. The discovery did not create his conviction. The conviction had already occurred. Instead, it answered the remaining question of location. For almost 14 years, Michelle had been missing. Now investigators could finally recover her remains and bring the physical investigation to its conclusion. The significance of that moment belongs first to Michelle, not to Clark. True crime stories can easily become centered on the offender, especially when the offender is described as unusual, frightening, or mysterious. But the facts of this case are ultimately about two victims. Michelle was a 6-year-old child whose life ended before she had the opportunity to grow up. Laura was a 23-year-old woman whose life was also cut short. Their identities should not disappear beneath the identity of the person who killed them. Clark's name became widely known because of what he did, but the consequences were carried by the people left behind. The families of both women had to live with the permanent loss created by the crimes. The recovery of Michelle's remains could not restore what had been taken. It could only end one particular form of uncertainty. There is also an important lesson in the distinction between suspicion and proof. Clark has sometimes been associated with other disappearances or described in popular accounts as a possible serial killer. Those claims may be part of the broader mythology surrounding him, but they should not be confused with the two murders for which he was convicted. The responsible account is narrower and in many ways more powerful. We know that Clark was convicted of killing Michelle Dorr. We know that he was convicted after admitting responsibility for Laura Hodling's murder and leading investigators to her body. We know that Michelle's remains were eventually recovered after Clark led authorities to them. Beyond those facts, caution is necessary. The existence of additional suspicions does not automatically create additional victims. A person may be investigated for several crimes without being convicted of them. A confession may concern one offense, while other allegations remain unverified. A collection of suspicious circumstances can raise questions without answering them. For a true crime narrative, maintaining the distinction is essential. It prevents the story from becoming a legend built on assumptions rather than evidence. The case of Hadden Clark is therefore not ultimately defined by how many crimes he might have committed. It is defined by what can be established: 2 victims, 2 convictions, 2 families permanently affected, 1 investigation that lasted across more than a decade, and 1 child whose remains were finally recovered after years of uncertainty. The story began with Michelle Dorr disappearing from a familiar neighborhood in 1986. It moved through an investigation that initially focused elsewhere, then changed direction after Laura Hodling was murdered in 1992. Clark's conviction for Laura's death brought investigators back to Michelle. Old evidence was reconsidered. New forensic methods were applied. Prison statements were examined. Searches were conducted. In 1999, Clark was convicted of Michelle's murder. In January 2000, her remains were finally found. The sequence illustrates how difficult justice can be when evidence is incomplete and time has passed. It also demonstrates why investigators must be willing to return to old cases when new information changes the context. Michelle's disappearance was not solved in 1986. It was not solved when Laura was killed in 1992. It was not physically solved when Clark pleaded guilty in 1993. It reached its legal conclusion in 1999 and its physical conclusion in 2000. Each stage mattered. And through all of them, the most important fact remained unchanged. Michelle Dorr deserved to be found, and Laura Hodling deserved to have her death answered for. Hadden Clark's legacy should therefore be approached without sensationalism. He was a man convicted of 2 murders, not a character whose crimes need to be expanded beyond the evidence to become frightening. The documented facts are already enough. Michelle and Laura were real people. Their deaths were real. Their families' losses were real. And the years required to establish the truth were real. In the end, the most enduring part of the case is not the mystery surrounding Clark. It is the persistence of an investigation that continued searching for answers long after the original disappearance had become a cold case. For Michelle's family, the final answer came almost 14 years after she vanished. It could never give them back the 6-year-old child they had lost, but it could finally give them the certainty that had been absent for so long. Michelle had not simply disappeared into an unknown future. She had been murdered, her killer had been convicted, and her remains had finally been brought home. That is where the story should end. Not with the mythology surrounding Haddon Clark, but with the names of the victims whose lives were taken: Michelle Dorr, 6 years old, and Laura Hodling, 23 years old. The record establishes their deaths. The courts established responsibility. And after years of uncertainty, both cases reached an answer.